Somewhere deep in the frozen silence of Montana, a sound emerged, fragile, trembling, just loud enough to tug at the edge of awareness. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the groan of trees burdened with frost. It was a cry, a soft, desperate whimper, barely audible, almost lost in the hush of falling snow. It came from a creature so small, so alone, that nature itself seemed to hold its breath. A German shepherd puppy, no more than a few weeks old, lay crumpled near a slushy trail at the edge of the timberline. He was coated in snow, smeared with blood, and trembling uncontrollably. His paw dragged limply behind him, as if it no longer belonged to his body. No collar, no scent of people, no trace of how he'd gotten there. He had nothing, no one. Miles away, tucked between the jagged outcroppings of the Swan Range, a man named Thomas Ridge was walking his land. At 63, Thomas had long since traded noise for solitude conversation for the quiet ache of memory. His weathered cabin stood like a forgotten monument, and he wore his silence like armor. He didn't go into town unless forced. He drank his coffee black. He didn't expect company. But that morning, something cut through him, the cry. A sound too thin for wolves, too broken for birds. He stopped mid-step, boot-crunching ice. Listened. There it was again. Another cry, more urgent this time, followed by a different sound, branches cracking. A low, rising growl carried on the wind. Thomas's spine tensed. His fingers reached instinctively for the rifle slung across his back. Something was out there. Something more than hurt. Something being hunted. Without a word, Thomas turned from his trail and slipped into the trees, moving swift and sure through snow he'd known for decades. The cries grew louder, ragged, and full of panic. Then he saw movement, fur small and shaking just as a massive blur exploded from the trees. A bear. The pup lay collapsed beside a frozen stream, too weak to even lift his head. The bear loomed over him, breath steaming in the cold paw raised. Thomas didn't think. He just raised the rifle. A shot rang out, one perfect thundercrack that split the woods in two. The bear froze mid-strike head, jerking toward the echo. For a moment, everything stilled. Even the wind paused. Then, with a final guttural roar, the beast turned and thundered back into the trees, branches snapping in its wake like matchsticks. Thomas didn't wait. He sprinted forward and dropped beside the pup. The dog was limp blood seeping into the snow breath, barely there. But he was warm, still breathing, not gone, not yet. Thomas's hands hovered before they settled gently on the tiny frame. Deep claw marks raked the pup's side, red and raw. It was the kind of wound that didn't heal without help. "I've got you," Thomas murmured, voice low and rough, like it hadn't been used in years. The words came out unplanned. They surprised even him. He wrapped the fragile body in his ranger jacket, the same one he'd worn through every bitter winter since his wife died. He held the pup to his chest, where the faint warmth of life pressed against him like an ember. He moved fast, slipping on the icy trail knees, protesting, heart-pounding. The bear was still out there, maybe circling. But Thomas didn't care. Every step was a war against time. Back at the cabin, he laid the pup on a folded blanket near the fireplace. His hands were shaking now, stained with blood and snow. He didn't know if the dog would survive the night, but he whispered again anyway. "Hold on, boy. Just hold on." Then he stood, jaw clenched, grabbed the truck keys from their nail by the door, and carried the pup back into the storm. There was only one place he could go, one sliver of a chance. He wasn't going to lose another soul. Not tonight. The old pickup groaned as it came to life, coughing against the cold, like a man waking from a deep, aching sleep. Thomas slammed the door shut and turned the heater all the way up. In the passenger seat, the bundle wrapped in his ranger jacket barely moved. The bleeding had slowed, but the pup's breathing was shallow, uneven. Each inhale sounded like a plea. Thomas gripped the steering wheel like it might hold him together and pulled out onto the snow-packed road, a narrow scar through the forest, now buried under relentless snowfall. The truck's headlights pierced a tunnel of white. Visibility was trash, but he drove. 40 miles. That's how far it was to Kalispell. That's how far between a second chance and another grave. He talked as he drove, quiet, broken sentences, barely more than murmurs. Maybe to the dog, maybe to himself. "You've got fight in you, huh? You've got guts. I'll give you that. Don't go quitting on me now. I didn't shoot that bear for nothing." The truck fishtailed on a curve, tires, skidding dangerously close to the ditch, but Thomas righted it with steady hands. His eyes flicked between the road and the pup. At one point, the pup let out a low, pained sound. Not a cry. Just fear, maybe. Thomas reached over and laid a hand on the bundle fingers, pressing into warm fur. Still alive. Still fighting. And that was enough. He thought about pulling over more than once just to breathe. But every time he looked at the pup, he saw something. Something that reminded him what it meant to care, to protect, to not lose. Not again. He kept driving. No radio, no distractions. Only the drone of the heater, the slap of the wipers, and the faint breath of life beside him. By the time the edge of Kalispell came into view, dim streetlights blurred by snow, his knuckles were white against the wheel. He made a sharp turn onto a back road and pulled up to a small white building with a faded sign, Dr. Melissa Grant, Veterinary Medicine. The lights were off. Thomas threw the truck into park, jumped out, and opened the passenger door. He cradled the pup, gently aware of how fragile the little body was, now more cloth than flesh. Up the icy steps, he pounded on the door. Nothing. He hit it again, harder. A flicker of light inside, then footsteps. Then the door opened first an inch, then wide enough for Melissa to step into view. She was in flannel pajamas, hair, tousled eyes blinking against the porch light. "Thomas?" she asked, more confused than alarmed, until she looked down. She didn't need an explanation. "I need help," Thomas rasped. "Now." She stepped back. "Bring him in." The moment they stepped inside, warmth wrapped around them, but it did nothing to ease the urgency. The clinic wasn't some sterile hospital. It smelled like pine floors and antiseptic, but it had what they needed: purpose, a chance. Melissa moved fast, barking instructions under her breath. She flipped on the overheads, cleared the exam table, and pulled a blanket from a cabinet. "Lay him here." Thomas obeyed, lowering the pup onto the table like he was made of glass. Melissa peeled back the jacket. Her face tightened. The wounds were worse than she expected, deep gashes lined with dried blood skin, already swelling with infection. "We have to move fast," she said. She cleaned the gashes, flushed the wounds, injected antibiotics. Thomas stood by, fists clenched, shoulders locked, heart pounding. "He's strong," she murmured, "but he's losing too much blood." He didn't reply, just nodded. He already knew. Then flatlined. A long, piercing beep filled the room. The monitor showed nothing. No heartbeat, no breath. Melissa grabbed the defibrillator. Not yet. She placed the pads on the pup's tiny chest, counted out loud, and shocked. The body jumped. Nothing. Again. Then flicker. A beep. Another. The line on the monitor twitched, caught, and finally began its uneven rhythm. Melissa exhaled hard. He's not done. Thomas didn't realize he'd been holding his breath until his knees nearly gave out. He leaned against the counter, hands trembling. Melissa worked in silence, stitching the worst of the wounds, cleaning the rest. The pup was unconscious, but his breathing had steadied. He wasn't safe, not yet. But he wasn't slipping anymore. "He needs time. Antibiotics, rest, someone with him all hours." "I'll take him," Thomas said, voice low. Melissa turned toward him, brows furrowed. You live out where there's no cell signal, no people, no support. I'll do it." His tone wasn't hard. It was final. She studied him for a long second. Then she looked at the dog, small and bandaged, and breathing. "You always did show up when no one else would?" Thomas reached out, laid his hand gently on the pup's paw. It was warm, alive, the first living thing to touch his world in a very long time. He stayed by that table for hours, saying nothing, just listening to the faint beat beside his palm. The storm howled outside, but inside, something else had begun to stir, something Thomas hadn't let himself feel in years. Hope. Morning came slow. The storm had crept back into the hills, leaving Kalispell hushed and blanketed in white. Light spilled through the clinic's frosted windows, and still Thomas hadn't moved. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. His hand had stayed on the dog's paw all night. Not once did he let go. There was something sacred in that stillness, a kind of understanding that needed no words, no promises, just presence. The pup stirred under the blanket, barely. A flick of an ear, a tremble in his ribs. It was fragile, but it was life. Thomas leaned closer, his face drawn with exhaustion, and something deeper, something like prayer. The dog didn't open his eyes, but his body said enough. He was trying. Melissa returned late that morning, coffee in one hand, eyes scanning the vitals. "Fever's breaking," she said softly, still critical, but he made it through the night. She sounded surprised. Maybe Thomas was too. "He can't stay," she added after a beat. "I don't have space here, and he needs round-the-clock care." Thomas didn't hesitate. "I'll take him." Melissa gave him a look, a mix of disbelief and concern. "Thomas, your cabin. I know. No heating backup, no vet nearby, no support. I know." She studied his face, searching for any crack in his resolve. Then finally she sighed. "You better not let him down." Thomas said nothing. He simply stood, lifted the bundle into his arms again, and wrapped it in the same jacket, the same promise. Outside, the wind bit at his face. But he didn't flinch. He moved with a quiet purpose, the kind that only comes from pain, turned into protection. The truck groaned as he opened the door. The pup let out a tiny whimper as he was laid gently into the passenger seat. Thomas reached over and brushed his fingers across the matted fur. "You're not alone now," he whispered. The drive back to Flathead Lake was slow. Ice slicked the roads. Snow drifted down in lazy sheets. The forest stood silent on either side, like it too was holding its breath. Thomas glanced over often. Still breathing, still warm. That was enough. Back at the cabin, something had shifted. It wasn't louder, or brighter, or warmer, just less empty. He stoked the fire until it glowed amber, and laid the pup down near it on a wool blanket. Then he sat beside him, towels in hand, slowly patting the wounds, cleaning what he could. Every movement was deliberate, gentle. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was quiet, like he was relearning what it meant to have someone to talk to. "We'll get through this," he said. "You're safe now." The pup didn't respond, not right away. But just as Thomas turned to rinse a cloth, he heard it a sound so soft it might have been imagined. The tail. One single wag. Thomas froze. Looked over. The dog's eyes were slits just barely open, and then, with great effort, he nudged his nose against Thomas's boot. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't a cry. It was trust. And something in Thomas cracked again, not in a way that broke him, but in the way that let something new inside. Light, maybe, or hope, or the simplest thing of all, connection. That night, he didn't sit in his usual chair. He laid a blanket next to the pup and sat on the floor leaning against the hearth. Close. Breathing in time with another creature for the first time in what felt like lifetimes. No words, no music, just warmth. 2 stories barely hanging on, but still here. By the second day, the dog tried to lift his head. Thomas caught it out of the corner of his eye. "Easy," he murmured. "No rush." The pup licked his cracked lips and let out a low, tired whine. It hit Thomas like thunder. He cooked broth, no salt, just warmth, and cooled it with snow. Fed the pup 1 spoonful at a time. Bit by bit, he accepted it. And then something small and astonishing happened. The dog nudged the bowl with his nose, just once, asking for more. Thomas laughed, not loudly, not with joy, but with the kind of fragile relief that creeps in when grief loosens its grip. That night, snow dusted the windows like powdered sugar. Outside, the trees stood tall and still. Inside, the dog slept belly rising and falling. Before drifting off, he stretched one paw just far enough to touch Thomas's leg. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud, but it was real. The heartbeat of 2 survivors who had learned too much about loneliness. On the 3rd day, Thomas found himself talking, more really talking. He told the dog about his old work in the woods, how he used to fix things, how winters used to pass faster when someone else was around. He didn't speak for sympathy. He spoke because for the first time in a long time, it felt like someone was listening. "You need a name," he said aloud. The dog blinked, then let out a low grunt, half breath, half sound. Thomas thought about it, then shrugged. "Dog," he said. "Just dog. Not Buddy, not Max, just honest, plain, strong." Dog didn't flinch. If anything, his tail twitched once beneath the blanket. That night, Thomas didn't sleep. He stayed by the fire. Dog curled against him, their warmth shared, built from more than wood or wool. Built from memory, and pain, and something else neither had words for. Outside, the woods were still, but something was moving, watching, waiting. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, wood cracking in the stove wind, brushing the pines and the soft thump of Dog's tail against the floor. He was healing. Slowly. The limp was still there. His ribs still showed through patchy fur. But the light in his eyes, steady, curious calm, had returned. He followed Thomas from room to room with quiet determination, like every movement mattered, and maybe it did. Thomas spoke more now, half to himself, half to Dog. Little things. The snow level. The stubborn leak in the roof. How the stew needed more salt. Dog would blink slowly or tilt his head. Sometimes he'd let out a soft huff or thump his tail once like punctuation. They were learning to speak the same language, one shared silence at a time. Then came the sign. Late afternoon. The light outside was starting to lean, blue shadows, stretching long. Thomas had stepped out to chop firewood. Dog trailed behind, slow but steady nose to the air. The wind was clean. Pine, damp bark, and something else. Attention. Then Dog stopped mid-step, frozen, eyes locked on the edge of the woods behind the shed. Hackles raised. Thomas followed his gaze and saw it. Claw marks, deep, fresh, gouged into the side of the shed. Not old scars. New rage. The bear had returned. Adrenaline lit Thomas's veins before his brain caught up. He dropped the axe, scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. too still. Even the birds were silent. That silence didn't mean peace. It meant something was watching. He snapped to motion, ushered Dog back inside, bolted the cabin door. Every window checked. Lanterns lit along the porch, casting long shadows across the snow. His hands shook as he loaded the rifle. Not from age, from memory. He'd seen violence come quickly before. He knew it didn't knock twice. And this time he had something to lose. That night Thomas didn't sleep. He sat by the fire rifle at his side. Dog curled near his feet, breathing steady but tight. Alert even in rest. Outside, the woods had changed. The cold had taken on something new. Not just nature. Intent. Past midnight, a crack-sharp distinct snapped a branch outside. Thomas rose, rifle in hand. Another sound. A low growl. Distant but heavy. Then silent. The kind that screams. Dog stood too trembling, not from pain, from recognition. He knew the sound. He remembered. The bear wasn't wandering. It was hunting. Finishing what it started. Thomas said nothing. He walked to Dog's side, laid a hand on his back. In that touch was everything promise. Protection. Partnership. The sound came again. Closer. A breath against the trees heavier than the wind. A growl that didn't echo, but settled into the chest like a clock ticking down. Thomas didn't flinch. He stood steady, rifle raised, eyes on the dark outside the porch. Dog stood beside him, small scarred but braced. Then it hit. The shed exploded inward with a crash like war drums. The bear was no longer circling. It was charging. Thomas barely had time to react before Dog moved blazing past him, faster than he had any right to move after all he'd endured. No hesitation, no fear, just pure blistering loyalty. He placed himself between the porch and the roaring beast. Barking, snarling body, trembling but unmoving. The bear halted, surprised maybe at the audacity. Then it lunged. Thomas screamed, a sound ripped from somewhere deep. The bear's paw struck. Dog flew sideways into the snow with a yelp that split the air like bone. Everything slowed. The blur of white fur, the weight of the bear. Thomas's scream caught in his throat, but Dog didn't stay down. Bruised, bleeding, limiting, he stood. He stood, and he barked, louder, angrier. A cry of defiance from something small refusing to die quietly. And the bear. It flinched. Thomas saw his chance. Instinct took over, rifle raised, breath steady. He fired not to kill, but to command. The shot roared across the clearing. Thunder in the trees. The bear froze, locked eyes with Thomas, and in that held second something passed between them. A line drawn. Neither wanted to cross it again. Then the bear turned, crashed back into the forest. Gone. Only steam on the snow and blood in its wake. Thomas dropped the rifle, collapsed to Dog's side. His hands shook as he gathered him in close. "Got you," he whispered, over and over. "Got you." Dog was barely conscious, but alive. There were no words big enough for what had just passed. No sentence to hold that much survival. Just a man and a dog, both torn in places no one else could see, clinging to something neither thought they'd find again. Someone worth fighting for. That night they didn't sleep. They simply breathed. In the stillness after the storm, one truth echoed louder than gunfire. The man who had lost everything had just been given something back. And the dog who had once been left behind had found something no bear could ever take again. A place to belong.